welcomes, there'll be stories, myths and legends in equal measure to delight and entertain you. Whether you're listening to a native storyteller in one of the many much-loved pubs with a pint of something refreshing at hand, or travelling the countryside discovering romantic castles, dramatic coastlines, crumbling ancient churches, peat bogs, moors, mountains, mysterious fort rings, and inexplicable standing stones, the tales are endless, and as you're about to discover, completely addictive. When it comes to unravelling the myths and legends of Ireland, just like the traditional stories of practically every culture, the biggest problem comes when trying to differentiate between fact and fiction. But then, never let it be said that the truth should ever be allowed to get in the way of a good story. Part of the joy of Irish heritage comes from the myriad of larger-than-life characters scattered the length and breadth of the country. And if you feel that some of the tales told here deserve to be taken with an equally large pinch of salt, then so be it. However, take great care when travelling the highways and byways of Ireland to show due deference to the fairy folk that live beneath the green mounds of the rolling hills and the deep waters of the rippling lochs. For example, that most famous of the little people, the leprechaun, faces total extinction every time an unbeliever airs his views. Be careful not to utter the suggestion that leprechauns don't exist, as for some people this is highly offensive, because each time such skeptical words are spoken, another leprechaun will die. Why anyone would want to preserve one of these rather bad-tempered, tiny old shoemakers dressed in traditional green may seem one of the very greatest of Irish mysteries. But as you journey around the countryside, make sure you listen out for the tapping sound of the leprechaun shoe hammer. Because if you should ever hear anything of the kind, good fortune may well come to bless you and yours. It's common knowledge throughout all Ireland that a leprechaun possesses a hidden pot of gold, and if caught, he can be forced by fair means or foul to give up his treasure to his captor. Catching a leprechaun's tough enough, but hanging on to one is almost impossible. Take your eyes off a leprechaun for a split second is all he needs to vanish from sight forever, and all hopes of finding his fortune will disappear with him into the ether. So maybe it's worth putting your logical thought process to one side and letting your imagination run wild, because after all, you've got nothing to lose, and who knows what you might gain. That said though, there are plenty who pour gentle scorn on the leprechaun, as being nothing more than a whimsical entertainment for the many visitors who seek out the pleasures of the Irish countryside. But like most things in Ireland, if you delve a little bit deeper, you'll find a richer reward way beyond anything you might have expected. In Ireland, there are two types of history. There are the mortal men and women, the high kings, the brave warriors and writers, musicians and painters that have recorded the turbulent times of the real progress of Ireland for posterity. Then alongside this indisputable timeline, you'll discover the magical, mysterious history of the fairy kings and queens, born of the gods and known collectively as Tuatha De Danann. Legend has it that when Ireland was conquered by ancient invaders, the gods were driven underground, taking the form of fairies, to dwell in the twisting palatial labyrinths deep under the earth. As you look at the rolling landscape of Ireland today, let the country's magic sweep you along. The fact that there might be fairy folk living beneath your feet does add an extra dimension to this truly splendid place. When it comes to romance, there's no better place on God's earth to be than at the lakeshore of one of Ireland's beautiful lochs. Here the stories of Tír na nÓg, the land of eternal youth, echo all around the deep rippling waters where the fairy folk and any mortals transported there will live for all time, untouched by the ravages of age. Take a long lingering look at the stunning Loch Corrib, Ireland's second largest lake, where one of the most famous tales of Tír na nÓg is told.
Cormac, a young hero, stood here day and night, lamenting the loss of his love Mary, a beautiful maiden stolen away by the fairy folk and held captive below Loch Corrib's glassy surface. Not another soul believed his story, declaring Mary to have drowned in a tragic accident. She is not dead. She has no grave. She lives beneath Loch Corrib's water, and in the murmur of each wave methinks I catch the songs I taught her. This was the constant cry of Cormac as he sat wailing for his lovely Mary. Now everybody in Ireland will tell you that the fairy folk have little patience with such fanciful nonsense, and one night they arrived in spirit form to confront Cormac, hoping to rid themselves of his moaning and groaning by terrifying him away. But Cormac was made of sterner stuff, and he bravely stood firm, yelling, "Christ save her soul!" With fierce yells and fiendish shrieks, the fairies had no counterattack and vanished immediately from sight. Cormac had broken their spell forever, and Mary was at last restored to him, a gentle wave washing her familiar form to the waiting arms of her faithful lover. Moving southwards to the spectacular Killarney Lakeland, who could fail to be impressed by the magical Loch Lean? Again, romance just blows in the air here, with reports of the beautiful, ageless, whimsical spirits of Tír na nÓg actually appearing above the water on May Day each year to commemorate the disappearance of the great chieftain O'Donoghue to the land of eternal youth. O'Donoghue was a wise, fair and brave leader, much loved by his people, and in true Irish fashion was famous far and wide for the great feasts he threw at his castle, where hospitality was his speciality. A banquet was laid before the guests as usual, but on this particular occasion an eerie hush fell over the proceedings as O'Donoghue went into a trance, predicting the future with all the authority of Nostradamus for those around him. Rapt with attention, the crowd watched aghast as O'Donoghue rose from his throne to walk mesmerised to the lake shore. Reaching the land's end with a solemn, measured, majestic tread, he stepped out onto the glassy, rippling surface and quite literally walked upon the water. Once at the centre of the lake, O'Donoghue appeared to return to reason, turned to his friends, raised his hands in a triumphant greeting, and promptly disappeared beneath the waves. This was the last that was seen of the great O'Donoghue in mortal guise, whisked away to Tír na nÓg for the rest of eternity. Anyone fortunate enough to stand at the lakeside on a May morning as the sun's rays waked the sleeping countryside might well see a rolling wave carrying the ghostly warrior O'Donoghue astride a magnificent phantom steed across the water. A host of floating, graceful, ethereal maidens always accompany him, dancing and singing celestial music in the early morning mists. It's said that those who have reported seeing O'Donoghue and his beautiful entourage are never sure if they've actually seen the spirit of the much revered hero, or whether the magical atmosphere of the mystical water has bewitched them into a dream of utmost aesthetic charm, from which they never want to wake. So at one end of the scale of Irish myths and legends, you have the wee tiny fairy folk. But Ireland's nothing if not a land of complete contrasts. And when it comes to giants, they have some of the most spectacular specimens you're likely to find anywhere in the world. The evidence of their existence can be pretty convincing, particularly if you make the journey to the dramatic Antrim coast of Northern Ireland and the magnificent Giant's Causeway. The notable 18th century English writer Dr. Johnson was rather scathing about this stunning landmark, dismissing it as worth seeing but not worth going to see. But perhaps it wasn't the destination that was his problem. Maybe tourist travel of the 1700s was just too perilous an occupation to make even the greatest wonder of the world seem worthy of the effort of getting there. However, when the causeway lies beneath your feet, where tens of thousands of hexagonal columns rise out of the sea, it matters little what anybody else might think, as you can't help but be impressed by this truly wondrous sight. Now I could tell you all about the geological science behind this landform, about the cooling effects of the sea on molten igneous rock. But what the heck, giants are much more fun. The ancient Irish have always claimed that this causeway was built by Finn McCool, quite literally a legend amongst legends. The mighty giant Finn had fallen in love with a Scottish giantess across the Irish Sea. And to reach the huge beauty that had taken his fancy, he started to build a causeway to reach the object of his desires. All was fine, until a Scottish giant, who was also rather partial to the lady in question, took a dim view of the Leviathan Irishman stealing his woman away from under his nose. An almighty battle ensued, involving a great deal of rock flinging and abuse hurling, until eventually Finn could find nothing else at hand to throw. With one mighty stride southward, he clawed out an immense lump of County Tyrone and threw it at his menacing Scottish adversary. Unfortunately for Finn, the size of his missile was more than he could fire accurately, and he missed the target by miles. Instead of obliterating his rival as planned, Finn ended up creating the Isle of Man, the result of his misdirected gigantic throw. Where the land had been hacked out of the countryside by Finn, a huge expanse of water formed, and the beautiful and enormous Loch Ness, Ireland's largest lake, came into being. This spot at the water's edge has an impressive dignity in a bleak, windswept setting, and the 18-foot-high cross is a remarkable testament to the tenacity of the 9th century monks who constructed it to glorify their monastery. Having had a chance to see these mighty examples of the great Finn McCool's handiwork, it's well worth investigating the legend of Finn further. Searching out the places associated with Finn will literally take you from one side of Ireland to the other, and a lovelier or more dramatic landscape you'll not be likely to find anywhere. Finn was born the son of a mighty mythical chief, but only after his father had been slain by enemies. The young boy was brought up in secret and tutored by a wise old man who had searched the rivers of Ireland all his life for the salmon of knowledge. This magical fish, if eaten, would grant absolute wisdom, and it had been the old man's ultimate quest. However, when he finally caught the great fish in the fast-flowing River Boyne, things didn't go quite as planned. Finn was handed the salmon to cook for his teacher, but in his haste he burnt his thumb whilst doing so. Finn's reflex action was to suck the afflicted digit, unwittingly receiving the wisdom himself. On realizing what had happened, Finn's mentor knew that his pupil was the one intended for such blessings, and the young hero ate the rest of the fish. You'll often hear Finn McCool referred to as all-knowing, and this is why. But these fishermen here today will be more than happy with whatever they catch. Although there'll never be another salmon of knowledge, some of the greatest fishing in the world is to be had in Ireland, and many travel from great distances to enjoy the experience. Finn McCool grew into a mighty warrior leader who ruled with fairness and wisdom. Like all great mythical heroes, Finn was a real hit with the ladies, and many fell under his hypnotic spell. However, as is often the case with matters of the heart, it was the girl that got away that gives us the most interesting tale. And as we head off to the remarkable craggy slopes of Ben Bulben, the story will unfold. Finn was getting on rather in years, but this did little to quell his appetite for attractive young women, and he was betrothed to the beautiful Grania, the passionate, spirited daughter of a legendary High King. But Grania had set eyes upon the bewitchingly handsome Dermot, blessed by the gods with a love spot on his forehead that made him irresistible to women. Legend has it that poor Dermot's life was an absolute misery, pursued wherever he went by a bevy of persistent beauties smitten by his aphrodisiac charms. Grania was determined to have the lovely Dermot for herself, and after much pleading and begging, he finally agreed to elope with her. Needless to say, the jilted Finn McCool was furious, and not being a man to let such infamy pass by unavenged, he chased the two lovers all over Ireland for 16 long years, until finally reaching the mighty mountain Bell Bulben. On the top of Bell Bulben, Dermot's tragic destiny was played out. A wild boar that had already killed 30 men on that fateful morning encountered the fleeing Dermot and charged at him mercilessly. As Dermot lay bleeding, he drove his sword into the boar, killing it outright. And close to death himself, he waited for help. But first on the scene was Finn McCool, ironically the only man in Ireland who could save Dermot, having the magic gift to restore the wounded with a cup of water. Finn looked with contempt upon the gored, mutilated body of the once irresistible Dermot. "Would that all women in Ireland could see thee now, for thy excellent beauty is turned to ugliness." With these words, Finn refused to come to the aid of the dying man, leaving his love rival to perish where he lay. Distraught at her loss, Grania vowed revenge upon Finn McCool. But eventually he wooed her, and despite being some years later than planned, he took her back to his fortress on the hill of Allen as his bride.
Today there's little to see at this once famous hill, but the open views around show the significance of such a vantage point. Travelling just a short distance from the Hill of Allen will bring you to the Hill of Tara, once the seat of the majestic High Kings of Ireland. The Gaelic name for Tara means the place with the wide view. And just like the Hill of Allen, this is exactly what you get. And it was from this strategic placement that the ancient Celtic kings defended their right to rule. To this day, the Lia Fail, the Irish Stone of Destiny, stands at the summit of Tara. If any man wished to lay claim to the title High King of all Ireland, he had to stand upon the Stone of Destiny, and if he was the country's rightful ruler, the Lia Fail would roar its approval. The great heroes of legend all converged here, and it's interesting to note that there was a real Finn McCool. He was a warrior bodyguard for King Cormac MacArt, High King of Ireland from 218 to 254 AD, at a time when Tara was at the height of its power. It would certainly seem that, like many of the myths and legends from all over the world, there's a degree of truth at the bottom of the stories concerning Finn McCool that have grown to epic proportions over the centuries of telling. With the advent of Christianity and the arrival of Ireland's patron saint, St. Patrick, in the 5th century, Tara lost much of its political influence. But for successive generations of native Irishmen, the abandoned rolling green hill of Tara becomes a powerful patriotic symbol for the land of their birth. And to this day, the very mention of the place will send many an Irish immigrant misty-eyed wherever he happens to be in the world. Ireland has without doubt had a turbulent history, fighting off a whole range of would-be invaders, and of course in more recent times, battling for independence from the United Kingdom. In 1843, Daniel O'Connell, a much respected latter-day Finn McCool, was raising support for a rebellion against the union with Britain. 1 million people with banners festooned with the colours and imagery of Ireland gathered at the Hill of Tara to hear the great man speak. Whatever the rights and wrongs of what's transpired since, historically, Daniel O'Connell's rally must have been a spectacle to behold. And looking at the emptiness of today's view, it takes a good imagination to appreciate the drama of the scene. It's always been said that in polite society, there are two subjects that should never be mentioned: politics and religion. Having just touched upon politics, we may as well defy convention altogether and risk a legendary foray into religion too. Our next story takes us to the beautiful Glendalough, appropriately named, meaning the Glen of Two Lakes. Ringed by the steeply wooded slope of some stunning mountain scenery, the landscape itself
would be sufficient to encourage a regular influx of visitors. But this tranquil beauty spot is one of Ireland's most frequently visited tourist attractions, thanks to the legend of St. Kevin, the colourful Celtic saint who made Glendalough his home. A hermit's cave, hidden high amongst the rocks, was Kevin's chosen abode, where he dedicated his life to prayer and meditation. But just like poor Dermot, he suffered the terrible affliction of being irresistible to women, and he spent much of his time fending off the unwanted, amorous advances of many a local maiden. One persistent beauty caused him so much trouble, he slept even higher up the rock face to avoid her. She foiled his plans by creeping into his bed during the night, and the man of God was so horrified to find her there when he awoke, he pushed her directly into the lake. Another young lady proved not so easy to dislodge from his rocky outcrop, and the virtuous saint needed to throw nettles into her face before she could be tipped unceremoniously into the waters of Glendalough. However, when it came to animals, St. Kevin was much more successful, and he's often known as Ireland's homegrown equivalent to St. Francis of Assisi. On one occasion, whilst removing yet another lusty lady from his sleeping quarters, a blackbird landed and built a nest upon St. Kevin's outstretched hand, this being far more acceptable than a woman in his bed. The saint remained where he stood until the blackbird's eggs had hatched, furthering his reputation for having a close affinity with animals. A wild otter from the lake is also said to have supplied Kevin with fresh salmon daily as he stood waist deep in the freezing water at his daily devotions and prayers. Whatever the truth of St. Kevin and his exploits, the buildings left here, constructed by his later disciples, are truly lovely. The ruins of a 9th century cathedral are immediately evident, but most visitors head straight for a 2-storied private chapel, now known as St. Kevin's Kitchen, complete with a steeply inclined roof and a small round tower. In the distance, a much larger, magnificent 110-foot-high round tower dominates the landscape, where the monastic followers of St. Kevin were able to take refuge against marauding Vikings so many centuries ago. There are those that complain that Glendalough, deep in the Wicklow Mountains, has been spoiled by the destructive trample of visitors' feet. But a blissful calm still manages to pervade the area, and the place is definitely worth the attention of anyone searching out the myths and legends of Ireland. Although Glendalough is a popular destination on the tourist map of Ireland, our next legend takes us to Blarney Castle, and without doubt, the most famous piece of Irish mythology of them all. Now, it's a well-known fact that if you want to hear a story told properly, you need to ask an Irishman. Because when it comes to charm, eloquence, and let's face it, the gift of the gab, you'll find no equal anywhere else on God's earth. So it's hardly surprising that when a legend promises to endow the believer with the gift of Irish eloquence, thousands flock to give it a try. This is Blarney Castle, just north of Cork, the home of the famous Blarney Stone. And today queues of visitors will wait patiently, hoping that by kissing the 4 feet long, 1 foot wide piece of limestone, they will be blessed with the gift of the gab. It has to be said, it's a pretty precarious business because the stone is embedded 83 feet above the ground, high up in the battlements of a 15th century tower. With a steady nerve, the would-be kissers need to pucker up whilst lying on their backs hanging out of the tower upside down and head first, hoping that the 2 strong fellers gripping their shins don't let go. Having heard the stories of Finn McCool and his Giant's Causeway, not to mention St. Kevin and his fair ladies, you'll no doubt be wondering how on earth this bizarre and quite frankly terrifying tradition came about. The story goes that back in the reign of Queen Elizabeth I of England, the empire-building monarch demanded that Cormac McCarthy, Lord of Blarney, surrender his castle to English rule. McCarthy was a wily old bird, and he came up with all sorts of excuses as to why he shouldn't relinquish his stronghold. But one night he paced the castle's ground, unable to think of one more reason to offer his English overlords. Just as he was about to resign himself to defeat, the Queen of the Fairies appeared before him, saying, "Don't vex yourself, go home and go to sleep, and in the morning get up at dawn and go outside. There right before you, you'll see a big stone, kiss it, and you'll never want for again." Cormac did exactly as the fairy had bidden, and sure enough, he was never at a loss for words again. So successful were his remonstrations to the English court that an irate Queen Elizabeth reputedly expostulated, "Blarney, Blarney! What he says he never means, and it's usually Blarney." This was the birth of a new word in the English language, and to this day, Blarney is used to describe a constant, clever, procrastinating babble of talk. As for Cormac McCarthy, he was astute enough to realise that one fast-talking Irishman in the vicinity was quite sufficient, and he went to great pains to haul the magic stone up to the top of his battlements of his castle, to ensure that nobody else could kiss it. But he didn't allow for the power of a growing legend, and the sheer number of visitors who risk at the very least a crick neck, year in year out, is quite astonishing. By the way, if you're worried about the number of germs left here by kissing tourists, all the guidebooks faithfully promise the stone is disinfected at least 4 times a day. The cynical might suggest that through the ages, enterprising castle owners had come up with a legend or two to improve their fiscal prospects. But keeping the balance between survival and exploitation can be a delicate one. Not that commercialisation is always a bad thing, as a visit to the lovely Kilkee Castle, the oldest continually inhabited castle in Ireland, will demonstrate. Kilkee is now a fine hotel, but guests are left in little doubt as to the historical significance of this excellent fortress and the myths and legends that surround it. An unusual carving high upon a wall is worth a further scrutiny, as this is a well-carved example of what's known throughout Ireland as an evil eye stone, depicting a grotesque old hag. The idea was that this would act along the same lines as a lightning conductor, deflecting all outside evil away from the castle and protecting the inhabitants within. But head for the haunted tower of Kilkee Castle, and ghost stories abound despite the presence of the evil eye stone. This legend concerns the 11th Earl of Kildare, better known as the Wizard Earl, who made Kilkee Castle his home in the 1500s. With all the powers of the occult at his disposal, his wife asked him to display to her his magic powers. The wizard warned her that if she showed any fear throughout his demonstration, he would be lost to her forever. As she assured him that she had nerves of steel, he granted her 3 requests. Firstly, the wizard swept the flood up around the castle walls and she showed no fear. Secondly, he transformed into a serpent that twisted around her feet, and again the lady showed no fear. But lastly, the wizard returned as a blackbird to sit upon his wife's shoulder. At that exact moment, a cat hiding in the room sprang out at the blackbird, which flew at speed out of the open window. Unfortunately, the wizard earl's wife screamed loudly, fearing for her husband's safety, which condemned him to banishment with all his brave knights to another realm. The poor woman never saw her husband again, but it's said that on the 7th day of the 7th month, every 7 years, the wizard earl returns to the haunted tower riding a white charger, shocking any hotel guests that happen to be in the residence. It's said that when the silver horseshoes worn by his fine steed wear out, the wizard will return to Kilkay Castle for good. An interesting prospect for the present day owners. Come down from Purple Mountain, come ye through the glen, across the loch and burren, come the Irishmen. Beneath their dancing banners, as to the call they hail, the sound of fife, the sound of skin, come the children of the Gael. The fight for supremacy over the Rock of Cashel through the ages has often hinged around the struggle for Irish independence. It was once the stronghold of the kings of Munster, who claimed to rule the south of Ireland, always refusing to accept the authority of Tara. The history of this amazing rock fortress makes it one of the most battle-scarred monuments in all Ireland. From some distance away, the crag stands out dramatically, a 200-foot-high limestone outcrop dominating the surrounding farmland. The ruins of a medieval cathedral stand atop, with the oldest part of this magnificent complex being Cormac's Chapel, an ancient tribute to the 12th century king who built it. Some think that his remains occupy the stone sarcophagus, but nobody can say for sure. At one point, a huge cathedral was built here by the English King Henry II, but it was always a thorn in the side of the Irish, who saw it as a symbol of England's efforts to subjugate them. Eventually, an Irish nobleman simply burnt it to the ground, and when hauled before the king to answer the charges and asked why he had done such a thing, he replied that he thought, "Didn't I think the Archbishop was inside?" The cathedral was restored, but yet again a dispute with the English caused its destruction. Oliver Cromwell isn't the most popular of historical figures in Ireland, even today, and he along with his Roundhead army came to enforce English rule upon Irish rebel armies. Here the men, women and children of County Tipperary sought refuge in the cathedral as fighting raged all around. But Cromwell, as legend has it, showed no mercy, with every last Irishman massacred before the sacred building was burnt to the ground once more. Consequently, in a similar way to the Hill of Tara, the Rock of Cashel has become symbolic in the legendary tales for the struggle for Irish independence. But without doubt, it also has great religious significance, as it was here that St. Patrick is said to have picked a shamrock leaf to explain the mystery of the Holy Trinity to his disciples. Of course, St. Patrick went on to much greater recognition as Ireland's patron saint. And as for the shamrock, well, you can't go far in Ireland without seeing its unmistakable image somewhere. No look at the myths and legends of Ireland could possibly be considered complete without exploring the surprisingly magical stories and mystical locations associated with St. Patrick. Not all nations are as enthusiastic about their patron saint as the Irish, with St. Patrick's Day parades and all kinds of traditions being honoured on March the 17th each year. The cynical comments of the uninitiated, loudly screaming that St. Patrick wasn't even Irish, are pretty much ignored, and it all adds to the spice of the story. Historical sources suggest that St. Patrick was born in Scotland around 373 AD, when the Romans occupied the British Isles. At the age of 16, he was kidnapped by pirates, a fairly common occurrence in such dark days of looting and pillaging, and sold into slavery in Ireland, where he was put to work looking after sheep. Some years later, he managed to escape aboard a boat to France and took up holy orders to become a priest. By the time Patrick returned to Ireland, he was in his 60s, responding to a vision he had in which the people of Ireland had been crying out, "We ask thee, boy, come once more and walk amongst us." And Patrick did just that, criss-crossing the country, spreading Christian word throughout the land, encountering more than his fair share of giants and fairy folk along the way. From the stunningly beautiful St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin to tiny chapels hidden in the remotest locations, the saint's well-preserved image can be seen everywhere. One of the finest examples of an abbey founded by St. Patrick is to be found at Ballintubber, which literally translates as the townland of St. Bridget's Well, there being a well close by where Patrick baptised his early convents. This remarkable abbey is exceptional in that Mass has never ceased to be celebrated here despite the best efforts of Oliver Cromwell and his Roundheads to destroy the place. Fascinating as Ballintubber is, it's the positioning of the abbey on the pilgrimage road to the holy Mount Croagh Patrick that makes it of special interest, and the journey from here to the dramatic mountain where St. Patrick is said to have chased all the snakes out of Ireland is still travelled along by pilgrims to this day, and it is in fact our next destination. Croagh Patrick is a 2,510-foot high quartz-veined mountain with a very distinctive conical shape. The legend goes that St. Patrick, from the very summit, flung a bell down the steep slope, enticing the snakes and other repellent creatures of Ireland to follow it like lemmings into the sea. Each time Patrick hurled the bell, spirits rose up from the waters returning it to him, the process continuing until all the snakes were gone. Though the burning question leaves you wondering why on earth the saint should want to do such a thing. Perhaps the symbolic pagan image of the snake was an affront to Patrick's piety. But one thing's for sure, there have been no snakes in Ireland since. Of course, there are perfectly feasible scientific explanations for the absence of Irish serpentine life forms, but none of them are half so much fun. On a more serious note, Croagh Patrick is a very significant site for pilgrims, and they come in their thousands each year to trek up to the rocky path to the summit chapel. Today, the majority of pilgrims wear shoes, a luxury thought decadent by the devotees of days long since past. The 2.5-hour ascent, and the subsequent descent for that matter, must have been a torture for the barefoot souls, and from time to time, a particularly ardent pilgrim will still make the journey to the top of the mountain shoeless. However, don't think that you need to be religious to appreciate the delights of Croagh Patrick, because this beautiful mountain is well worth the climb for the lovely views to be seen all around, whatever it is that motivates you to get to the top. As our tour around the myths and legends of Ireland draws to its inevitable conclusion, there are many images ranging from the great giant causeway of Finn McCool to the lovely locks of Tiernanog that will remain in your mind's eye for all time. But one thing you'll definitely have realised by now is that there's never a shortage of stories and tales to delight visitors to this remarkable island. As one legend is uncovered, having taken you to some spectacular location, the next one unfolds before your very eyes, and it's never a problem working out where to begin. It's wondering when you'll ever finish that'll all too soon with a very pleasant problem that preoccupies you. But don't forget that half of the magic of Ireland comes from the Irish people themselves, where generations of storytellers have imparted great legends of the old country to their offspring. There's no shortage of folk happy to pass on the myths and legends of Ireland, and of course, just listen to the traditional songs. Whiskey in the Jar, The Irish Rover, and Molly Malone, just to mention but a few, and you'll hear even more of the country's heritage in lyrical verse. Lastly, remember that like the golden whiskey that Ireland is so famous for producing, a landscape of such epic proportion with myths and legends grown from eons of storytelling needs to be savoured slowly and at your leisure, hopefully leaving you with a mellow sense of well-being and a warm glow that'll bring you back to Ireland's rocky shores before you know it.